A babysitter in Nebraska is charged with killing the baby girl she was supposed to be caring for. We're discussing the heartbreaking results of an autopsy on the 3-month-old and the case against the sitter with attorney Florina Altshiler. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Elizabeth Millner, in for Jesse Weber. 20-year-old Tiffany Cure is charged with felony child abuse resulting in death. She was babysitting a nearly 4-month-old baby in Marquette, Nebraska. The Hamilton County Sheriff's Office got a call that Stormy Swartz was unresponsive inside a home. An autopsy the next day showed the baby had 2 skull fractures. The deputy also said the baby was in a house that smelled like urine and had dog feces on the floor. Law enforcement did not reveal Cure's exact relationship to Stormy. Cure is being held on a $750,000 bond, and she can't have any sort of unsupervised contact with children. Cure is next in court at the end of the month. If convicted of felony child abuse resulting in death, she could face the rest of her life in prison. I want to thank Morgan & Morgan for sponsoring today's Law & Crime YouTube takeover. The stories we cover here on Sidebar and Law & Crime are very tough, and it shows that the world is an unpredictable and at times very scary place. So if you're ever hurt, it can be scary and confusing, especially if you don't know where to turn. But Morgan & Morgan, America's largest injury law firm, can help. This is a team with more than 1,000 attorneys you should want in your corner, and there's a reason they're America's largest injury law firm. They win a lot. In the past few months, they've secured multiple multi-million-dollar verdicts that were actually considerably higher than the highest insurance offer. And we're all on our phones so often that Morgan & Morgan makes this whole process so easy. You don't even have to leave your couch. From submitting your claim to uploading documents to signing contracts, it can all be done from your phone in 8 clicks or less. So if you're ever injured, you can start by easily submitting a claim at forthepeople.com/YouTube takeover. I'm joined now by attorney Florina Altshiler. Florina, thank you so much for being here with us today. This is truly a horrific case. You have a 3-month-old baby who died allegedly at the hands of someone who was supposed to take care of her. And an autopsy revealed she had 2 skull fractures. What's been your take on this case?
Anytime a young child passes away, it really is just a horrific situation. With skull fractures, there is the suggestion that that's not something that necessarily happens accidentally. Although young children can fall and can be injured, multiple skull fractures are what would suggest to me that this is not simply an accident, but perhaps the child being either thrown or hit repeatedly. Because a child doesn't accidentally fall once, crack their head, get up, and fall again and crack their head in a different location.
And what does that also suggest to you about the vulnerability of the sweet baby? I mean, just months old. Obviously, you know, they're not walking at this point, so it does suggest that maybe something nefarious did happen here. What are your thoughts just about how defenseless this child was? Again, just months old against this 20-year-old babysitter.
Right. Unfortunately, and I've seen these cases many times, people babysit, people watch children, not having the experience and most importantly, the patience necessary to watch and monitor a very young child. Babies cry, babies scream, babies are irrational, and babies are difficult to control. So it takes a lot of patience and the ability to watch a child. And sometimes people who don't have that patience, who don't know how to handle children, themselves act irrationally and criminally and completely overreact, and also do not understand just how fragile and vulnerable a young child is, so that the amount of force necessary to result in a fatal injury may not necessarily be all that much force. And so sometimes babysitters or adults who are watching children will shake a child or will throw a child. And if you do that to an adult, right, you grab someone by their shoulders, you shake them, that's really not going to result in much. But you do that to a 3-month-old, and it can and often is, unfortunately, fatal.
And authorities noted the home where baby Stormy was located smelled of urine and had dog feces. What do you make of the conditions of that home, and does that suggest to you the baby may have been neglected and left on her own?
Yeah, oftentimes when there's conditions in the home that suggest that the child was not attended to or pets were not attended to, there's feces, there's urine, things are not cleaned. It is suggestive, not necessarily of criminal action, but it's suggestive of neglect. It's suggestive of somebody who's supposed to be taking care of that child, of the dog, whoever else is inside the home is really not doing that. Now, taken together with the physical injuries, it suggests something far more nefarious, not just neglect, but criminal activity.
And these child abuse cases, they're always just very horrific. And while we don't know the extent of baby Stormy's prior relationship to the defendant, whether she may have been extended family or just simply a babysitter, any thoughts on why this may have happened?
Oftentimes, people are put in positions of taking care of children where they really just do not have the temperament, the training, or the experience to take care of children. And let's be honest, it's not easy to take care of a child. Children are very active, children are very vocal, children don't really listen to what you tell them. Babies don't understand anything, and aren't able to do what you tell them and don't act the way that you want them to act. And so it takes a lot of patience and a calm disposition and a good temperament to be able to watch children and to raise children. And most of society is, of course, able to do that without a problem. But some people overreact. Some people don't know how to act. Some people don't understand that a very young child is going to have very soft bones that are still developing and that they're going to break very easily. And it's not a lot of force that's necessary to do that. And so you can't just grab a child. You can't shake them. You can't hit them. You can't, and this sounds like common sense. As I say it, I'm thinking, why do I even need to say this? This is common sense. You can't hit a child. But I think when people act irrationally in the moment and emotionally, they're not thinking about consequences and they're failing to realize that acting impulsively and either shaking or hitting this child could very well result, as it did here, in death. And that's just not part of their mind frame at the time, unfortunately. And it is horrific because the child's defenseless.
I just think it's interesting that the babysitter in this case, again, I know these are allegations and very limited information is out as far as the relationship between baby Stormy and the babysitter, but I would think that if the babysitter did feel overwhelmed, that she would just call the parents and be like, hey, can you come home early? Can you help me out here? Is there anything or any other option she had besides allegedly, having these skull fractures on this poor, young, innocent child? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, you're asking a very reasonable and rational question. And the problem is, we're talking about somebody who did not act in a reasonable and rational way in the moment. Of course, those would be great alternative options in that situation. Frankly, anything would have been a better alternative option than what allegedly happened to this child at the hands of this babysitter. Part of the problem too, and this is where I hope listeners really kind of pause and think about this, is you really have to be careful about who you trust your child with. Many people across the country will just have like the 14-year-old kid next door watch their kid for a couple of hours, or hire somebody that they meet online without checking references, without doing a criminal history, without doing any sort of background check. And we figure that, oh, well, they're old enough. How difficult can it be? I'm just going to run out for an hour or two. This person can watch my child. And luckily, most of the time that's true and it's fine. But when it's not true and it's not fine, the risk is a dead child. The risk is a very, very serious risk. We're not talking about, I went over to Starbucks and they messed up my coffee. Fine, we'll fix it. We're talking about an infant that is dead. So you really have to pause and you really have to think about Who am I trusting my child with? And I'm certainly not suggesting that this is the parent's fault. Things like this should not happen. Parents should be able to trust their child with an adult who says that they will take care of the child. But unfortunately, in the society that we live in, there are people who really are ill-equipped to take care of children. And they sometimes volunteer themselves, and sometimes they're volunteered into positions of being the caretaker of a child that they should never caretake for. They don't have the temperament for it. They don't have the patience, and they don't have those basic skills of pausing and, just like you said, calling the parents and saying, hey, I'm just having a really tough time with this child right now. Can you come home early? I need a break. And when you bring somebody like that into your home and trust your child with somebody like that, who just is going to lose it, basically, this situation occurs.
And what are your thoughts on baby Stormy's parents and how they're feeling right now? I can't even begin to imagine how they could be feeling right now.
Right. Anybody that loses a child under such tragic circumstances is obviously going to be distraught, and distraught beyond words that we can even come up with, since we're not in that situation. Sometimes people feel guilt. People blame themselves because they rethink, what could I have done differently? They replay the situation. They think about how, if only I didn't do this, or if only I didn't do that. Unfortunately, in situations like this, and in all situations, we can't take back time. We can learn and we can move forward. And that is much easier for me to say sitting where I'm sitting than being in their shoes and having to endure what they're enduring in this moment. And who knows when they're going to be able to make peace with something that is just a complete, utter tragedy.
In terms of the legal system, how much say will the parents get in this case as far as punishment is concerned?
So every district attorney's office is a little bit different, but for the most part, most district attorney's offices will consider what the victim wants in the case. Now remember, it's not the victim suing the defendant, it's the state or the county, the people, right, bringing a criminal action against the defendant. So while the victim's parents, who are the victims here, don't technically have a say because they're not a litigant, they often have a say because they're the impacted party here. And district attorneys' offices will often consult with the victims to see what they want to happen. Do they want the person to get the maximum sentence? Do they want to be more lenient? Are they looking for some sort of treatment? In a case like this, likely we're looking at significant incarceration, not treatment. But it's something that the district attorney's office will listen to and then will weigh with whatever the other factors are. So how strong is the evidence? Can they prove causation? Do they have an expert that's going to be able to opine that the death of this child resulted from criminal activity versus negligence or an accident? The stronger the evidence, the less likely the district attorneys will want to plead this case out. The weaker the evidence, the more likely they would be willing to offer a favorable plea. Potentially, if the evidence is very weak, the case may ultimately have to be dismissed altogether. And those are factors that the district attorney's office will consider, oftentimes while speaking with the family. Certainly, if there's a plea or a conviction at trial, when the case goes to sentencing to determine punishment, the judge will allow an opportunity for a victim impact statement. So the family can speak directly to the court and express to the court what the family wants and how they have been impacted by all of this. And that's something that the judge considers when rendering a sentence.
In your opinion, are child abuse cases tougher to prove in terms of the prosecution who has the burden of proof?
So the prosecution always has the burden of proof, and they have to prove each and every element of the crime that they are charging a defendant with beyond a reasonable doubt. That does not change, and the burden never shifts. The problem or difficulty with child abuse cases is we're talking about a child. So in cases where the child survives and is able to report an incident, their believability is limited. The younger the child, the less credible they are, right? Children make things up, children are inconsistent, some children don't understand the difference between the truth and a lie. In those cases, those children can't even testify because they're just far too young and they can't swear to tell the truth, which is something that has to happen in court. In death cases, it really doesn't matter whether we're talking about a child or an adult, the person has passed away. And so the person can't come into court and tell us what happened. So in death cases, it heavily relies on forensics and it relies on admissions by the person who did it. So the more the person tells us or admits about what happened, the easier the case becomes since we have that information. The sooner the person says, I'm not speaking, I want a lawyer, the less information we have because there's really only two people who know exactly what happened. The child or adults in cases, right, who passed away, who can't tell us anything, and the person who did it. And if they're not talking, now there's really no way to know for sure what happened other than through science. And this is where doctors come in. This is where the autopsy comes in. This is where the injuries can be examined. And this is where conclusions can be drawn to say, this is not an accident. This is not something that happens accidentally. You don't crack your skull on both sides of your head from tripping and falling. This is where common sense comes in, right? And we say, just like you were saying earlier, if this is a 3-month-old child, the child's not walking. So the child can't trip and fall because the child really isn't even walking. So how does a child who's laying in a crib crack their skull in 2 different locations? Common sense would suggest at that point, someone had to do that to the child. The child could not have done that to themselves. And of course, the defense will come up with alternative theories, right? They might say, well, the child could have been on a changing table and rolled off. And then it's really up to the prosecution to prove, no, this is not something that happened by accident. This is something that happened intentionally. And it's not easy, but it's going to depend on what the facts are. It's going to depend on what the evidence is, right? Sometimes there's cameras inside the home, like baby monitors, that could have captured the whole incident. Sometimes the person who did it makes a confession. Sometimes there's blood left behind. Sometimes there's DNA left behind. Sometimes the autopsy tells us a really clear picture. And once we have all of the facts and all of the evidence is when we can make a determination of this is a strong case, or this is a weak case, or this is a case that's so weak that it's not possible to prosecute.
And beyond that, this was just an accident. Does 20-year-old Tiffany Cure really have any defenses at play here?
Well, we don't know all the facts. One defense is always, wasn't me. The it wasn't me defense doesn't require, but to a jury essentially requires, well, okay, who was it then, right? She has to be able to pin it on another suspect, because just it wasn't me is not going to be enough if the prosecution is able to prove that she was there and she had control of this child. But maybe somebody else was there. Maybe this child was injured just before she got there. How soon did she report this? Did she call 911? What did she say when she called 911? What did she say when she reported it? So there's always the it wasn't me defense or the they didn't prove it defense. The best defense in cases of death with infants is a causation defense. And that defense is an argument that they have to prove that the defendant caused intentionally the death of this child. The defense would argue there's no proof of intent, that this could have been an accident. and that the prosecution has the burden of proving that it wasn't a mere accident and that the defendant purposefully did this. Usually it's an argument of experts, it's an argument of the science, and it's an argument of kind of what's missing or what alternative other explanations could there be. Did the child have some sort of condition? Is there an alternative medical reason for why this could have happened? But with skull fractures, we're not talking about a clogged artery or a respiratory issue or some disease or illness. We're talking about bones breaking, and generally outside of some sort of osteo condition, bones in the head don't just break on their own all of a sudden.
All right, well, Florina, thank you so much for your insight into this case. Before we sign you off, is there anything else you would like to add?
You know, my heart breaks for the family. And every time, unfortunately, we hear about these cases, I think it's far too often that we hear about these cases. And there really is not a great way of preventing this other than being vigilant and being careful as to who you trust your children in the care of. We see cases like this at daycare centers, with au pairs, with babysitters, with the babysitter next door coming over. And people really just need to be careful about who they trust their most precious child with, right? So I am sorry, and my heart goes out to the family.
All right, Florina, again, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Well, that does it for this episode of Sidebar. You can check out more episodes and subscribe to us anywhere you listen to your podcasts, whether it's YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify. I'm Elizabeth Millner, and this has been Sidebar presented by Law&Crime.